Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
My name is William Daughtry. I'm the head of school here at Montgomery Bell Academy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this special occasion. We are incredibly thankful for the long-standing partnership that we have had with Parnassus Books and Ann Patchett, enabling us to have such fantastic speakers such as tonight's with us. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Born and raised in the Boston area, Amor Towles graduated from Yale College and received an MA in English from Stanford University. Having worked as an investment professional for over 20 years, he now devotes himself full-time to writing in Manhattan, where he lives with his wife, who's with us this evening, and 2 children. His novels, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and The Lincoln Highway, have collectively sold more than 6 million copies and been translated into more than 30 languages. And story goes that both Bill Gates and President Barack Obama included A Gentleman in Moscow and The Lincoln Highway on their annual book recommendation lists. In preparing for this introduction, I found a story about Mr. Towles from a 2017 article in the Vineyard Gazette that I couldn't help but share with you. So when he was 10 years old, he threw a bottle with a message that read something like, "If this makes it to China, please write back." And a few weeks later, he received a letter that read, "I'm afraid your bottle did not make it to China." The letter was from Harrison Salisbury, then assistant managing editor of the New York Times. They corresponded for many years, eventually meeting when Mr. Towles traveled to New York with his high school newspaper staff. And the same connection featured in his book, A Gentleman in Moscow. It turns out that Mr. Salisbury, who had served as the first regular New York Times correspondent in Moscow, had written firsthand accounts of his own time there. He even featured in the book wearing a fedora and coat, those that the Count steals for his escape. In an interview about the collection of stories we're here to discuss tonight, Mr. Towles was asked about the title of the book. He replied, "When I finished assembling this collection, it occurred to me that in most of the pieces, a critical moment involved a pair of family members or strangers facing each other across a kitchen table to confront some new reality in their lives. I wasn't conscious of this while writing the stories, but it must have sprung from a conviction in my subconscious that our lives can often change materially due to a single conversation at a table for 2. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Towles and a local figure whom we admire and adore and who needs no introduction, Ms. Ann Patchett.
Is this, oh, it is. It's good. It's on.
Yeah, it's on.
Hi, friend.
Hi, Ann.
How are you?
And hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight.
Everybody.
Thank you.
So
Nobody
fun.
waves back in New York, so that's really pleasant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Because they're trying to pretend they're not actually there to see you.
That's right.
It's like, what? Yeah, you waving at me? The nice thing about owning a bookstore, and there are many nice things about owning a bookstore, is your friends come to see you every now and then when they publish a book. So thank you for publishing a book, and Maggie, thank you for coming along, and this is absolutely terrific. So Amor and I were talking this afternoon, and I said, do you want to have the conversation about TV and movies at the front or at the back? And And we had a little back and forth about which way would be better. And I said, I thought that maybe if we got it out of the way, people might pay more attention to us. Otherwise, they won't be listening while we talk about the book because they just really want to know about the television series. So, and also that I was at the dentist on Friday and everybody was saying, have you started watching Gentlemen? They just call it Gentlemen.
Yeah.
So tell us.
Well, the first thing I'd say is, so yes, for those of you who don't know, my novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, has been turned into an 8-hour television series starring Ewan McGregor.
They know.
Okay. I'm friends with Michael Lewis, the great nonfiction writer who wrote Moneyball and The Big Short and The Blind Side, and so he's had a lot of experience with his work ending up being turned into films. And we were having coffee about a year ago, and he said, "Hey, so how's the Gentleman in Moscow project going?" And I said, "Well, they just sent me the drafts of the first 3 episodes, and asking for my feedback, and they wanted to know what I thought." And I said, "But I think they might be just being polite." And there's a pause, and Michael says, "Amor, they are definitely just being polite. And not only do they not want to know what you think, they wish you were dead." It's true. So that was a reality check. But at any rate, so I did. It ended up being better than that. So the team that made the series, and I got to say, to their credit, the director and the writer for sure, but the head of costumes, the head of set design, the head of props, Ewan and the rest of the cast were very, and this came up a lot and very sincerely, is they were very interested in ensuring that they satisfied the readers of the book. And that's such a great, that's a protection for me, and that's so much better than if they were trying to make me happy, or if I was trying to be involved and make sure they did this or did that. Just the fact that they all really loved the book and wanted to do justice to the book for the readers, I think kept it on track in a great way. And then we've ended up with something I think that is, I've only seen half of it, but it's very beautiful, and Ewan McGregor is incredible. And I think that it does deliver most of the spirit of the original book. So it's most of it, I think, positive event.
Have they finished filming all of them?
Oh yeah, it's all done. Yeah, that's right.
You just have been busy and haven't gotten around to watching the whole thing?
Well, no,
Maybe in a hotel room on tour.
Yeah, maybe. They offered to make it available to me, and the head writer said, and I was kind of asking about that, and the head writer said, absolutely, we could show you the whole thing. And this was also when it was, they hadn't perfected the sound, they hadn't added the music, they hadn't perfected some of the, say, where there's a CGI element or what have you. And he said, "Amor, I got to tell you, we'll show you the whole thing. You can see it as often you like or as early as you like. And but he said, my personal experience is it's worth noting that you only get to see it once for the first time. And you may want to consider whether or not the first time you see it is when it's totally complete and refined, and it's the way that the rest of the world is going to see it." And then we watched the first 1 or 2 episodes in sort of that sort of penultimate stage, and I totally understood what he was saying. Mm-hmm. And then we went on set a couple times, or I did. My wife went, and my daughter came once. I went alone once. But I asked Ewan at one point, how do you feel about it so far? And he says, "Oh, I never watch it until it's released to the public." And so we went to the premiere in New York about 2 weeks ago, and that was the first time Ewan had seen the first episode.
Wow. And where did they film it?
It was filmed in Manchester, England, in a giant stage, studio, where because 90% of what happens in the story takes place inside the Metropole Hotel. So it was easier for them, in essence, to build the 8 major rooms of the hotel rather than to use locations. And of course, when the project was started, the assumption was that a portion of the filming would take place in Russia, but the events in Ukraine made that an impossibility.
How do you feel about reviews for the show as opposed to reviews for your work? In another way of saying, what's your level of sensitivity for that art
Yeah.
versus that art.
I get it. So, and it's an interesting question. When there's
Thanks, Seymour.
yeah, Ann. It's really, God, wow.
Didn't see that coming.
No, I didn't. You're sharp. Is when there's a good review, you're like, oh yeah, it's terrific, and well deserved, and and thank you very much. When it's a bad review, you're like, boy, those guys really screwed this up, or whatever, So like you don't have that with your own book. You have obviously when it's the book that's being reviewed, that's the thing that I created or that you created, right? And that's the one that you take personal, and any negative comment, even a small one, can sort of be sort of a pin in the heart, But when it's for the movie, it doesn't have that personal impact, and so you're kind of watching and saying, oh, I hope it. It's almost like watching, I don't know the equivalent, a nephew. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
you hope they win the lacrosse game, but you don't really care. Something like that,
Okay, that's especially good context here at MBA. So tell me about Lincoln Highway.
Yeah.
And also, is there something going on for Rules of Civility? We're not going to.
Oh, we're staying in Hollywood, okay?
Yeah, we are just for a minute.
Yeah, and so recently it was announced, and I'm very pleased about this, that that Lincoln Highway will be made into a feature film by Warner Brothers, but what makes it great is that it will be written and directed by a guy named Chris Storr, who wrote and directed and created The Bear, which the television series, if you haven't seen that television series, it's amazing. And he's terrific, and I think has a great vision for translating that book to the big screen. And so we'll see what happens.
And that's so interesting, because I think if ever there was a novel that would be a series, because that book is so episodic.
Yeah.
I would,
because that book, for you, those who haven't read it, is broken down into 10 days. The whole story is only 10 days, and it has sort of 10 sections. So you could tell that story as a 10 episode, series very easily, because it's kind of structurally laid out that way.
Right.
And when, it's sort of a fun thing where the studio says, listen, we've given the book to a guy named Chris Storr. We want you to go watch The Bear, and he would like to meet with you, but we're really interested in working with you. So is Chris, and so you watch The Bear, and then Chris comes to your house. I mean, it's really, it's a pretty lucky sort of thing to be and happen in life. But at any rate, he comes and he says, listen, I'll do this book as a series. I know that's something that you're open to or interested in, but I could also see it as a feature. I'll do whatever you think is right, and I can adapt to that. But I think it should be a feature, and here's why. And then he gave me two main reasons. And the first reason was, for those of you who read the book, is he said, one of the unusual things about this book, this is from his perspective, is that it has this great internal urgency, which is that you can feel things moving rapidly towards this sort of the final moment where the fates of the characters are all going to be in play, and it's inescapable. As much as you'd almost, as the reader, want them to escape sort of this final fated conclusion. And he said that's a beautiful thing in the book, and it's really very propulsive. And I said, there's no question that I can deliver that for you in a feature film. And he said, no one is going to be able to deliver it for you in the same way in a series, because we're going to constantly have to be tempering down the pace. Each time an episode ends, there might be a cliffhanger, but the next episode, we're going to have to slow it down and build it back up and slow it down and build it back up and slow it down and build it back up, and it won't have that rolling momentum. And I was like, I think that's it. Right or wrong, I thought it was very beautifully sort of a way of putting his artistic vision for the book.
Yeah.
And then the other thing he said, I'll just give you the second reason, was he said, I think that the nature of this book is that there's a chance to really, as he put it, to David lean it. He goes, there's landscapes in this story that are like, that are equivalent of Dr. Zhivago or Lawrence of Arabia, which are that they're going to be amazing on this big screen to see the Midwest in the 50s, where they begin to see the train crossing the country, to see, the Manhattan of the 50s, and from the perspective of the High Line. And he's like, that's going to be really big and beautiful, and it will lose something if we go right to the small screen. And again, when rightly or wrongly, I thought the enthusiasm for that vision is a reason to say, yeah, I'd like to work with you.
Absolutely. Okay, you want to tell me, is there anything we need to know about Rules of Civility before we go on?
Rules of Civility, I'm looking at my watch. Rules of Civility has been in, I'm trying to figure out how many years it's been in development. It's been in development for 13 years, and we are still working at it, so no answer yet.
Fair enough. All right, so table for two. I said this to Amor, I pride myself on never working with notes, but in fact, this is a book of stories, and I have notes. There are 6 stories, they're long stories, and then there is a 200-page novella at the end. 2 of the stories, Timothy Touchet?
Touch it.
Touch it? Oh.
I say touch it.
Okay, all right. And then
Like Patchett.
Yeah, like Patchett.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like that. And then the last one, which no doubt I will also mispronounce.
What,
You're trying to remember?
The
fragment?
The Domenico fragment.
The Di Domenico fragment.
Yeah.
Both of those were in little booklets.
Yeah. But strictly for family and friends.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I feel so special.
Yeah, no, only you got that. Like only a small group.
So nice. Okay, all right.
So what would answer and I actually quick say it as aside is that I've written short stories my whole life, and that's one of the ways I think many writers, not necessarily Ann, but many writers sort of master craft as younger writers by doing short stories of different kinds with different tones and different styles, and that way it gives you a chance to experiment with different manners of storytelling, and that's a way of refined craft. But in the last 15 years, I've principally written novels. But when I'm about to go on tour, I can't start my next novel while I'm on tour because it's too disruptive. When I'm writing a novel, I really want nothing else that's really commanding my attention. And so I started writing short stories kind of while I was sort of in between the novels, while I was doing things like this. And so but I didn't really have any, I wasn't submitting them to the New Yorker or that kind of thing. But so what I do is occasionally I'd bound them, and then I'd send them out to friends and family for Christmas kind of thing. And then suddenly you look back and you're like, oh, I've got a bunch of them now. And maybe this actually, I could pull these together and it would be interesting to think of this as a book. And so then last year I finished 2 stories. I wrote a story from scratch, and then I took Even Hollywood and expanded it dramatically, and then that's the book that you have. Yeah.
So what's the oldest story? What year did you write it?
All of it's written in the last 10 years, roughly, and the oldest piece is the first 50 pages of Eve in Hollywood.
All right. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to start with the line, which is such a spectacular story. As I said to you, and I've read all of your work, these stories really speak to me. I mean, I absolutely love them. They have a magic about them. They have a certain, almost a fairy tale quality, an out-of-time quality, which really all of your work has to some extent. But the line, which is written in third person, and when I was breaking these 6 stories down and the novella, thinking about how you went about it, it's a story that's set in Russia. So my first question is, what's up with you in Russia?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not Russian. I don't have any Russian heritage. I don't speak Russian. I don't have Russian background in my family. I fell in love with Russian literature as a teenager, and then that kind of started, like many Americans, with the 19th century novelists, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev and Gogol, and that was my first interest in Russia. And
Pushkin?
And Pushkin, yeah, absolutely, and Chekhov too, eventually, who comes later in that group. But I eventually then got interested in the Russian avant-garde that flourished in the arts before the First World War, and then I got interested in the Soviet era. And so, but it's one of my many cultural fascinations. I love the Renaissance. I love 1950s American jazz. And when you have something like that, you get quite deep in it, and it has a big lasting impression upon you. But so I think you're right, it begins with Rules of Civility, because Katie is the daughter of a Russian immigrant in Rules of Civility. And then, Gentleman in Moscow it was a story I wanted to write about a guy trapped in a hotel, and it made so much sense to set it in Russia. And by then, now you're like, it's like it's like being all in poker, Now I'm all, okay, we're going to keep moving forward with this. In the case of the line, it's a natural sort of side effect, because what ended up happening is as I was writing A Gentleman in Moscow, there's a moment where the Count's childhood friend Mishka has done time in the Gulag out in Siberia. He's been released, and he's returned to Moscow, to some degree a broken man. And a chapter opens with him walking across Red Square to go and find the Count, who he hasn't seen in nearly a decade, and since his arrest. And as he's moving, he observes a line, and he kind of sardonically describes the line because it's sort of evidence for him of the failure of this revolution that he was very much in favor of, but it's another sign of how things have not worked out. And while I was kind of writing that, there was a version of that draft where he starts doing this big list of all the kinds of lines in Russia that were on, that were there, that had become a part of daily life. And as I was kind of reflecting on that, I was like, it wouldn't be interesting if there was sort of a guy who, if the only thing he was good at in life was standing in line, And so when I finished A Gentleman in Moscow and I was on tour, that was one of the ones I was like, yeah, that's interesting. I'll explore that. Maybe I'll do a story about this guy who that's his, his great achievement in life is he's really good at standing in line in the Soviet era. And that, I'm not giving away much, but that story kind of ends up in New York. And the first 6 stories that kind of brings the reader to New York, and then you stay there for the next 5 stories. But that's kind of how that began.
The reason that I said Pushkin is because, of course, the character's name is Pushkin. All right. He winds up at one point at the Agency of Expatriate Affairs.
Yeah.
It's one of the most beautiful parts of this book. Would you tell us what the Agency of Expatriate Affairs is all about?
Yeah, and so...
The hardest line of all.
Yes, Pushkin meets a former artist who can't paint anymore under the current laws, and he says that he loves Russia. He stayed in Russia after the revolution, but he's been all of his ability to do art has been taken away from him, and he's been getting deeper into trouble for no fault of his own. And he says, so I've actually come to dream of that piece of paper with the red stamp and that gives you exit from the country, legal exit from the country. And Pushkin knows that, everybody knows that to get that is the hardest and longest line of all of Russia. And this poor guy says, Pushkin's like, well, you should go stand in the line, get the card. And he says it's impossible, and besides which nobody even knows where it is. And Pushkin's like, I know where it is. And so we go with Pushkin, and he says, I can't do it because if I go and do it, then I'll get in trouble. He says, no, I'll go for you. I'll stand in line for you in the line, and when I get to the front, you can come. And so we follow Pushkin to this fabled room deep inside the Kremlin, where you have to fill out an incredibly detailed form, which is ultimately telling why you should have the right to leave the country. And we go through that. And what ends up happening is Pushkin it takes so long to go through the line. To pass the time, he fills out the form. And so we kind of get this glimpse of aspects of his life and how he sees his life and how he sees Russia through this sort of the passive process of filling out this endless form. But I don't want to give too much away. But was there something else that you wanted me to say about that?
I just love that part. Yeah. That's all. Yeah. I just wanted to celebrate it with you for a moment. In the next story, it's about a guy who essentially is skipping a line.
Yeah.
And I'm going to come back to the line theme over and over again. There's so many sentences I underlined when I was reading the ballad of Timothy Touchette. He postponed the writing of novels through the study of practices. Oh my God, how many people have I known in my life who have done exactly that? But Timothy is a forger. And you want to just give him a little overview, quick? Or slow?
The setup of this is he's a young guy who's moved to New York to become a famous novelist. That's his ambition. Part of his problem, as he is well aware, is that he did not have a difficult upbringing. And he's very, and it's, as he says, oh my God, you think of Hemingway wrestled with alcoholism, and Faulkner had the deep, the South of Jim Crow's South that he had, he was living in, and he goes, and Dostoevsky, he went to Siberia, the real Siberia, not even the, not even the metaphorical one. He went to the real one, and he said, and they say the narrator says, Timothy's parents didn't even have, the kindness to get divorced or be alcoholic. So this is the situation he finds himself in. And so he goes to the New York Public Library every day, and he's supposed to be writing books, but instead what he does is he reads the letters and diary entries of his heroes, and then to pass the time, he starts sort of mimicking the signatures of the various authors that he loves. And an old bookseller, sort of a wily old bookseller, is walking by and sort of sees what he's doing, and he has a little bookshop selling rare books, and invites Timothy to come and work in the bookshop. But his intentions are that he sees that Timothy has an unusually good ability to make someone else's signature, and he figures that could come in handy as a rare bookseller. And that's how things go on there.
And it begs the question of, what do you think about signed books?
Oh, yeah. Wait, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, it is.
Because I just came from many of you have been to Parnassus. Parnassus is a beautiful place. What you don't know is that 2 or 3 blocks away is a lightless room, windowless room, where they stack books and make you sign them all.
We were going to ask you to spin straw into gold.
Yeah, I know exactly what you feel like. The door locks, and they're like, there's no going out until you sign 800 copies of your own book, And you're lucky to be asked to do that. But what was the question?
The question, sir, was, how do you feel about signed books?
I collect signed books, so I do collect.
Do you really?
I love signed books. Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I know that. You're right.
That poor mouthing about having to sign the books.
Yes.
And you love signed books.
It's true. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's right. That's right.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I do have a thing where the signed book doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah, well, you don't care about possessions. Famously.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But that a book doesn't get any better if it's signed.
No, that's true. I don't even know why we're talking about this, but
Because in some sense, it's what the story is about.
Yeah, I'll give you an example because maybe this is a window on me in some weird way. Anyway, so like for example, I love Proust. I think Proust is terrific, and I've read Remembrance of Things Past, the 7 volumes. I've done it twice, once alone, once with some close friends, and love it. A great hero of mine. And I love Charles Moncrief's. C.K. Moncrief did the first real great translation back in the 1920s, and I love that translation, and so that's great. Well, I stumbled on, as it were, actually my wife found this and gave it to me, but it's Charles Moncrief's has taken his when the Swan's Way, the first edition of Remembrance of Things Past, was published in English. He took the first edition of that and gave it to a close friend of his. So the inscription is to his friend, and it's signed Moncrief, first edition of the Swan's Way, but in English. But his friend is Joseph Conrad.
Wow.
And Joseph Conrad is a huge hero of mine. And so I was like, oh my God, like what an incredible thing. Like, the idea that Moncrief signed this translation of Swan's Way and gave it to Joseph Conrad, and that sits behind my desk and it fills me with joy. I don't know. See?
To which I say, well done, Maggie.
Yeah. Maggie, it is. Maggie does give these to me for my birthday, and I love them.
That's incredible. So, to me, that sheds light on the story.
Right.
Because,
true, right.
If it turns out that was just some kid sitting in a used bookstore who wrote Joseph Conrad.
Yeah. No, and of course, you're probably like this too, but a lot of probably more in my short stories than even my long fiction, there's something, little aspects of my life that are kind of percolating through it, and
sure.
And that kind of happens is kind of fun. Can I get you out of order?
Yeah.
Because we're on this topic.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that the opening pages of The Bootlegger, this story that comes later in the collection, is the most autobiographical pages I've ever written.
Oh, I want to know. Ouch. Are you the guy?
Wait, no, shh.
I'm sorry.
Ann, I'm kidding. But I'll tell you what happened, right? I think Maggie and I, we were in our early 30s or something like that, And maybe we got to the point where you could go out at night because the kids were, sleeping through the night. We had babysitters or something. And we decided, oh yeah, we'll go out every Thursday, we'll go out on a date, having not been on, gone out for a couple of years or whatever it is. And so anyway, I read an article in the New York Times that said that arguably the greatest pianist in the world, Evgeny Kissin, was coming to America for the first time. He's leaving Russia to come to America to play at Carnegie Hall, his first performance in America. And I read this, and I was like, oh, wow, that sounds great. Like and I said, Matt, maybe we should do this. She's like, okay, yeah, sure. Well, that sounds fine. We're not big classical music people in a big way. We don't spend a lot of time at Carnegie Hall, but this seemed like a fun event, so we put it on the list. Well, so then I call Carnegie Hall, because it says the tickets are going to be available, whatever. And so I call and I say, I'm looking to get tickets to this Evgeny Kissin concert. And they say, actually at this stage, the tickets are available, but they're only available to patrons of Carnegie Hall. And I'm like, oh, so what's that? Patron, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, that means, someone who gives money to Carnegie Hall. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, like, how much money, So they tell me the number, and I'm like, okay. Yeah, I'll do that. We'll make a donation to Carnegie Hall, and now we're patrons, and now I'd like to buy the ticket, to Evgeny Kissin's concert. And they're like, well, actually, it's not quite that simple, because now that you're a patron, you can buy tickets, but you can only at this stage buy tickets to a series in which Kissin is going to perform. And so I think it was like, 4 international pianists. 4 nights over the course of a month, you would go and see 4 piano players. And I'm like, okay, all right. Now I'm like now I can't go, now I can't stop, I'm too far in. So I'm not going, we'll buy the series. Maggie is like rolling her eyes, right? She's like sitting over there going, oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. This is now the most expensive date we've ever been on. We could have had dinner in France, So anyway, but now we have the tickets. So we're all excited. So we go, the first concert, it's not Kissin, it's somebody else. And we go and we're listening to the concert. We're sitting down, it hasn't begun yet. And at the last minute, the guy comes in, he sits next to us. And the way it works is when you have tickets to a series at Carnegie Hall, you have the same seats for every performance. And if you keep subscribing to that series, you could own those seats indefinitely for the rest of your life. And so this old guy comes in a trench coat and he sits next to me. And little old guy, and he probably had that seat, as I say, for decades or something. And so they're about to start, and then the performance begins, and I noticed he never takes off his coat, and he's got his arms on the things, and there's 2 little black stems sticking out of the sleeve of his coat, and I'm like, what is that? And then finally I'm like, oh my God, he's recording the concert. The dirty old dog is recording the concert. And so, I'm like, Maggie, look at this. And she's like, shh, And so it kind of really irked me. And so then we come back the second time, and now it's Kissin playing. And the old guy arrives again in his trench coat. He sits down. He's got the same recording device. And now I'm like really upset. And so I spend the entire performance fantasizing that I'm going to turn the guy into security, Like I'm really, going to really do some good moral action here, and so and of course I never do that, but I can't stop thinking about it. And here's amazing part of this is that I vividly remember this. The next day, the New York Times reports that Kissin's performance received the longest standing ovation in recent memory at Carnegie Hall, and I remember nothing about the performance. Nothing. Because I had spent the whole time turning in this old scofflaw in my mind, So that's one of those things. So for me, you go about your life, and then it's something. It wasn't like the next day by any means. It could have been like 6 months later or 3 months later. You're sort of wandering or running or whatever I was doing, and suddenly I'm like, oh, actually that'd be kind of an interesting story. To tell the story about the guy who, sits down and the old man next to him is recording the concert. And so, as I say, that's the first, couple of pages of the bootlegger, and that is exactly the way it happened. And then everything else is kind of, is made up.
Okay, this is really interesting. I was interviewing Zadie Smith once, and we were talking about autobiographical fiction. And she said, autobiographical fiction is not fiction based on what happened to you. It's what you are afraid of, or what you perseverate on, or what could have happened. And it was like a door blew open in my life. I thought, why didn't somebody tell me that when I was 18? But what you're saying is exactly that. It's an autobiographical story because there's part of you that knew that you could have been that guy.
Sure.
And
yeah.
you work through all of the moral ramifications. And in that sense, it's autobiographical, even though you never did it.
Yeah.
It's like you could feel that in yourself.
And you get to see what happens.
Right. Exactly.
The thing you didn't do, you finally get to do it and see what happens.
It's like It's a Wonderful Life.
Right.
It's like what happens to George Bailey
Yeah.
if he takes the other fork in the road.
Right.
Okay, so my question about that story, and it's connected to I'll Survive. In both of those stories, the narrator, the first person narrator, is the secondary character.
That's right.
So why did you make that choice? Because you really, in both stories, essentially hobble yourself by choosing the person who is not there for the primary action to tell the story.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'm going to take a step back and say this, which is that I'm in writing my fiction, I am a planner. So I'll come up with an idea and I'll start to imagine, okay, if the idea were a novel, this is what would happen. Sort of build a scaffolding. But then what I'll do is I'll spend usually 3, 4, 5 years filling notebooks by hand, imagining every aspect of the story. So everything that happens, all the characters, their backgrounds, their personalities, events, settings. I'll do opening paragraphs of chapters. I'll do some conversation. I'll do thematic elements, some of the tone, some of the poetry. I'll just keep filling notebooks until I know everything that happens in the book from beginning to end, basically. And that's the point at which I then write an outline and then start chapter 1. So that's the way that I work. And now in that process, like I may start with very rapidly a sense of where it takes place, who it takes place about, who's at the center of it, of the events, and who's, who are the main characters, the where, the when. I'll know the key events. I may know all that actually in the first night. So meaning like when I had the idea for A Gentleman in Moscow, I was going into a hotel, and I saw a guy in the hotel who I'd seen in the hotel the year before. And I was like, oh, man, on the elevator, I was like, a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. That's an interesting wstory. And within a period of hours, I had Russia, 1920s to 1950s, the Count, the Nina, Anna Urbanova, the Bishop. I had kind of had it all, the key elements. He'd become a waiter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then I'll spend the 3 years imagining it fully. Okay, well, in this process of the where, the when, the what, probably the hardest and the most interesting decision that I am going to make is the narrator.
Me too.
Okay.
Me too.
Yeah. And so I like to think of it as you could kind of break the narrator down into 2 parts. You could probably do more, but let's focus on 2 for a second. And the 2 parts are, first is, in essence, the point of view. And by that I mean, where is the narrator situated in relationship to events? So now if it's an omniscient narrator, that means the narrator knows all the events and everything about them and all the characters and what goes on inside their heads and what happened in the past, what's going to happen in the future. That's a narrator, right? But it could be the person who the main event is happening to. It could be the antagonist who's going to do the thing to the main person. It could be a family member, an observer, as it were. It could be I heard the story secondhand, from my parents. This is the point of view of the narrator, how I'm situated, how much did I witness myself, how much of it do I know? And you could add to that, is the narrator old, young, rich, or poor, which influences their point of view as they witness events and influences how the story is going to have to be told. That's one part. The second part is really tone. And the important thing to understand here is that you could make your decisions about the point of view. You can know exactly who's going to tell the story, and their background, they're old, they're whatever, or it's the brother who's going to tell the story, or whatever it is, and you could then tell that story with 20 different tones. Is that person sarcastic? Is that person jealous? Is that person secretly angry about what happened? And we're either going to know it or not. Is a person lying to us, right? And is a person funny and witty and rapid fire, telling things that are very slow and methodical and philosophical in the way they're going to tell the story. So that's only a tonal decision, and it has a huge implication for what the writing is actually going to sound like. But then it's going to have big influence, both of these things are, on the themes that grow out of the storytelling, because that point of view is going to have a very different sort of, in essence, you could think of it as sort of thematic landscape than a person with the generous person and the greedy person are going to have a very different sort of thematic outcome in the way that they describe the same events. Mm-hmm. So at any rate, these things are this is, as I say, the most interesting and challenging decision for me. In short stories, what's fun of it is that you're not going to spend 5 years writing it, or I'm not going to, 4 years or whatever. And so you go into it and say, okay, I know the event, I know the time, I know the place. Now, okay, who's going to tell this story? Is it going to be the omniscient thing? Is it going to be someone who's observing it? Is it going to be the main character who's the main character? And I will roll through those. So I don't do it systematically. What I mean is I now know the story, and I'll go with my first instinct. My first instinct is, it's going to be told by, the brother or whatever. And I'll try telling the story, in essence, to myself from the brother's perspective, and I'll start to learn better about who the brother is. And at a certain point, you say, it doesn't have the electricity, it doesn't have the pace I want, it doesn't seem to have. That person isn't there at the times that I want them there. And so you try something else. Let's tell from the perspective of the wife. Let's go, and maybe you start by doing it the main person. And that's a natural place to start. But it's boring. Or, or it's that person's then talking about themselves the whole time. And they know their inner thoughts. And that's kind of dull. And so I play with it. And eventually you sort of hit this voice and you're like, oh yeah, that's the right person to tell this story, and that's the right tone in which it should be told. And then everything really starts to come together. So I'll make this observation for those of you who read this book, is that
you're going to read it.
Yeah, well, is because this wouldn't be necessarily obvious to you, and shouldn't be obvious to you. But the 6 New York stories, what happens is actually they start super omniscient, like a really opinionated, aggressive, narrator who not only knows everything that's happened, but got opinions about what's happened and, makes jokes about what's happened or sly remarks about what's happened. But that's the narrator for the first 2 stories. But then what happens is, as Ann points out, the next couple of stories are actually not told by the principal figure. It's by someone who knows the principal figure. And so they're observing what's happening. And they have a lot of information about that person, opinions about that person. They have a certain perspective on events, but it's not happening directly to them. And so you're kind of getting closer to the action, as it were, but you're still kind of a little bit of a distant. And then in the final of the New York stories, you're actually with the main player, and he's telling you what happened to him and why it happened and what he does about it. And so I kind of like this quality of the 6 stories, that you're kind of almost in a cinematic way, moving from way above the planet and coming down closer and closer and closer until you hit the central person, because it's a very different writing challenge. And it's a very different reading experience. And so I think that's going to be enjoyable for the reader to feel, without it being conscious of it, the narration is shifting. The style of narration is shifting, and they without knowing it, they can, without being to articulate it, they can feel themselves getting closer. Now that you have the novella, which is half the book, which is Eve in Hollywood, and that's told from 7 perspectives. All of which are or most of which are in first person. So there you're really, deep into the psychologies and the experiences of the key individuals in that story. Which kind of completes that journey through the different types of narrative voice.
Let me give you a quick compliment, and then we'll go on to the novella, which is the endings of these stories are extraordinary. And with those 2 stories that I was just talking about, where the narrator is not the obvious choice, the payoff in both of those cases is that the narrator gets the final word, and it's incredibly moving. The ending of the story Hasta Luego brought me to tears. It's such a beautiful, sort of like a gymnastic, sticking the point kind of an ending. And so much of that has to do with the narration.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it also has to do with one of the advantages of the short story relative to the novel. And the novel has many advantages relative to the short story. And, I'll take a quick aside here, which is that when I was in high school, my hero was one of my heroes was my English teacher at the time, a guy named Dick Baker, who was a terrific intellect and demanded, very careful writing. And I'm talking about nonfiction writing, the essays that we wrote about literature that we were reading, and he would mark up your pages, very carefully when you submitted an essay, and it was a great labor of love, but we learned enormous amounts from him. Well, one of the most common things that would show up in my papers was it was the letters SUG, and SUG stood for sweeping unsupported generality. And he meant that as a criticism, So, but it turned out later on that it was my superpower. So, but anyway, here's kind of one of them. But for you, on this topic is, I think about the short story versus the novel, and I think that one big sort of difference between them is this dynamic of the sentence, of the closing sentence. Because when you think of a novel's hundreds of thousands of, more than 100,000 words for me, and so you get many sentences. So the final sentences, it can be beautiful, it can be the perfect ending, but it can't really sort of reorient you as a reader from what you've read over a period of weeks and weeks, let's say. In a short story, the final sentence can really do that. You can be reading through it and say, okay, this is what it's about, and it's this person, this character we're following, and these are the events, and this is what the thematically means, and you have more and more confidence, and suddenly in the final sentence, you could be like, whoa, because you really can turn the boat around in a short story in a sentence, at which point the reader steps back and says, oh my God, you know what? It wasn't about her, it was about him all along. And then the reader, you have to kind of go back and kind of relive the story through that new perspective, and it changes how you think of everything in it. And I think that's sort of a great dynamic that the short story allows, as I say, that the novel doesn't. And so that's sort of a fun thing. Not you don't want to do it in every short story, but it is fun to do. And I think the other big thing is, which in a way is a bigger difference, is that the novel is, and Ann, well, I know you might agree with me. This you might disagree. I don't know. But again, this is my sweeping unsupported generality. So here you go. I think the novel, by definition, almost always is very much consciously or unconsciously for the author, is about orientation. That the writer has to consciously or unconsciously prepare the reader for what's going to happen by giving them a sense of where they are, of who the characters are, what their backgrounds are, some of the issues that the characters face, the time and what that might mean. And if you go back and take your favorite novels and read the first 15 pages, you will find a lot of that. And if it's not definitely, you don't even notice it as a reader. You're just taking it in. But it's incredibly important for the writer to lay that, because as a reader, if you don't get that, you're sort of like, what is this? How long until I understand what the hell this is about, And you want to feel like, okay, now I know where I am, and let's go with the journey. And then you can sort of follow the journey step by step by step and take advantage of the evolution of characters and the evolution of events and the motifs that are layered, that accumulate into meaning. And all that is really a product of sort of this orientation and the process as it unfolds. In a short story, you do not have that. You cannot set it up in that way. You don't have the time to lay motifs. You don't have the time for characters to evolve. You don't have the time to set up settings and backgrounds and relationships. You're in. And that's kind of a beautiful thing about the short story. And so I've come to think of it as it has a very different capacity for surprise in this wonderful way. And I don't mean that like in a suspense story sense. I just mean it in like, once you're reading it, it's only 10 pages long, but like, where am I? Who is this? Who's he talking to? What happened the last night? You know, wait, is this in Connecticut or California? You know, like there's that quality to it, which is really kind of exciting. And you're kind of, each time you sort of get a little closer to understanding where you are, it's a little blink of surprise, but you can feel you're running out of time. You know, the story's almost over, and what is it about, you know? And so I also like to sort of make the most of that feeling, sort of that we're in it and then you're out of it. But you want to have a glimpse of the grander landscape of life somehow at the same time, you know?
I've enjoyed this so much.
Okay.
I mean, and I'm not done. I just really feel like I've learned something. This has been so interesting.
You're sweet.
Okay, so we got a little bit of time left to cover the second half of the book. We've got a few minutes. I feel like what you did in this novella is kind of everybody's fantasy. You write a book, years go by, you feel like, wow, I think this all the time. Boy, I wish I had known X when I was writing that book. I wish I had thought about that. Or you go out on the road and people tell you things, you tell them things, you start thinking, and it's like, yeah, I already wrote that book. I can't go back. I can't add to it. You did.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So tell us about that experience, about Eve Goes to Hollywood.
Yeah, Eve is Rules of Civility, my first novel, has three main characters, and Katie, who's the central character and the narrator, Tinker, who's a love interest, and Eve, who's Katie's best friend. And the love interest of Tinker is kind of shared between the two of them, depending upon the page you're on. And Eve is I loved Eve as a character in Rules of Civility. She's from the Midwest, but she's very independent-minded and willful, and sort of sexy in this great way. And hilarious, and will do the opposite of what everybody expects of her all the time, but in its great sort of genuine way. And she has a relationship that goes wrong in Rules of Civility. She gets in a car accident, which disfigures her to some degree. And so she says, she said, heads home, says enough for New York. And Katie says, what are you going to do? She says, I'm going home to Indiana. And this can happen. It probably happens. You've had it happen to you too. But I was writing. It was my plan. She goes home to Indiana. It was in the design of the book. I was writing the passage where the train is arriving in Chicago, and her parents are in Union Station to meet her. And all of a sudden, I was like, oh my God, she would never get off that train. Never. And it was like her shaking me, you know? Don't let me get off that train. So I was like, so suddenly I'm changing it. And then, she goes to California, extends her ticket, and disappears in Hollywood in 1938. And so when that book was done, I just kept thinking, oh man, what happened to her in Hollywood? And so 10 years ago, I wrote this sort of 60-page piece, which is 5 different people who meet her in her first 90 days in LA, and sort of their impressions of her and how the impression she makes on them. But it's very sort of, it's glimpsy. I mean, it's these sort of glimpses that you get. And I kind of, when I handed in the manuscript for Table for Two, that's what I handed in. I handed in the New York stories and this 60 pages. And the minute I handed it in, I was like, oh, you got to give me it back. Send it back. Don't read it yet,
Really?
And they're like, what? And I'm like, but, it's due. Or whatever. It wasn't really due. But so I said, no, I want it back. And then and this is true too, I flew to Los Angeles. I moved into the Beverly Hills Hotel, which is where Eve moves in when she arrives in this first 60-page story. And I began expanding it. And I had sort of these other ideas about what would happen to her. And I'm like, yeah, that should all be in there. And so, the 60-page story became a 200-page story. And it really does her greater justice as you really get to see how she impacts the lives of different people. And in this more intricate and I think fun way, because it's also kind of in a noirish style, which suits her really well.
How much time between finishing Rules of Civility and writing Eve Goes to Hollywood?
The first 60 pages, which are really kind of the first 60 pages of what you will read, or 50 of them, or something like that, I did in the first 12 months after Rules was done, when I was on the road.
All right.
Just like I was talking before. So when Rules came out, I mean. But then I sat on that for, I guess, a decade. Which
leads to the natural question, do you ever think about going back to Gentlemen in Moscow or Lincoln Highway and telling more of those stories, since now we know you're the kind of person who would do such a thing?
Well, yeah. Yes. Now that I've been revealed.
That's right. Who you really are.
And I love doing this already. I mean, in the sense that in Rules of Civility, Katie has this great love interest, the boyish Dickie Vanderweil, who's sort of a great free spirit, and he's a great character. And he's a central character in A Gentleman in Moscow, because he shows up many years later as an attaché, and ultimately a member of the State Department stationed in Russia, and becomes a great friend of the Count. When I wrote Lincoln Highway, Woolley in Lincoln Highway is the nephew of Wallace Wolcott in Rules of Civility, and both books feature the Wolcott family house in the Adirondacks, where there's sort of culminating events in both books that occur at that house. And so I kind of like the threads between the books already. And, in terms of like the sequel-ish version of that, I do think that like I could see myself revisiting Emmett and Billy and Sally from the Lincoln Highway, but I think I wouldn't do that for 10 years. I would do that at some point in the future. I could imagine myself revisiting them. But I don't know whether it would be to pick up the next day or to pick up 10 years later or 20 years later. I'm not sure.
Yeah. This has been extraordinarily fun. I so appreciate you coming. Maggie, I appreciate you coming. Sparky, I appreciate you coming. I brought my dog. I want to tell all of you that the books that you have are signed because we forced him into a room and locked the door. And if you would like Amor to write your name at the top, you may stand in a line and do that. Or you can just go home and call it a night and read this book and enjoy it so much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ann. Ann Patchett, everybody.
Amor Towles.
Thank you. Thank you.